Admiral Nelson of the Red Dawn never let his tension show to his subordinates. He left that to the AI scenarios he ran in private in the Hollow Suite, using the estimated power of the Co-starships to create battle scenarios. Defeat after defeat by the ascended Co had 9 worlds overrun and occupied by those who styled themselves as gods by the time his armada, which he'd built on the move, even turned around. Admiral Pike was on the way to the same destination as himself, but as of right now it appeared she would have to divert her path to start recapturing occupied worlds. The population is committed now, but if we're humiliated at this stage, what good will all our previous victories do? That was the great concern. Other peoples were growing in power. Smaller nation-states and empires were being gobbled up by their neighbors, and according to the leading military experts and their advisors, it wouldn't be long before the Republic of Man could be rivaled by some fairly aggressive neighbors. Humiliation before them? Occupied worlds given back only with meek pleading and supplication? Armadas broken so badly that it would take decades to rebuild? We may as well lie down before our neighbors and hope they are not too rough with us. How long until we get there? He asked his navigation officer. 3 more months, sir. She answered with quiet dread. He hadn't forbidden the running of simulations against the Co, other than the ones that were official in nature. But if they had, and he was sure they had, they knew what he knew. That the Co Armada was more powerful than anything else humanity had ever faced. He recalled the words of the president. Never surrender to humiliation. They hate our pride, for no one can be free and humiliated at once. They demand we call them gods, that we bow and scrape to beg forgiveness for our liberty, but I will not. We will not. We touched the face of God hundreds of years ago when we took to the stars, and we will never bow and scrape again. Fight them to the last drop of blood, until they feel a very human chill in their alien bodies and know that they are not gods, and they can die. Say what he would of the president. Nelson hadn't voted for him, but the man knew how to give a rousing speech, and he understood the danger in a grander sense than most others as far as the captain could tell. Losing a planet was a problem. Losing a war was a disaster. Present position of the Co Armada? He asked. On the way to conquer their 12th world, a place called the Vale. She answered. He ignored her assumption that the Co would win, but scratched his chin. Why does that name sound familiar? He asked. It tickled a memory somewhere in his brain. That's the common name for it. She answered. Its formal name is Valetudinaria. The colony is settled mostly by military veterans who found it hard to adapt to civilian life. Recognition snapped into his mind. Everybody knew that colony. At least every military person. It offered free land and a modular home for every veteran willing to settle there and donate 1 day a week of work to terraforming an unsettled region. It was famous for its mountains and its beautiful, peaceful scenery. Surprisingly, it even welcomed veterans from the Sacred Dark, the Ediaxa, and other conquered species. A soldier is a soldier, was the attitude of their governor, a retired general whose name escaped him at the moment. More famously than their residents, however, was the highly militaristic culture that governed the planet. A little smile was on his face for the first time in weeks. Sir? His navigation officer asked. Is everything all right? Oh yes, everything is fine. I was just feeling sorry for them. Captain Nelson answered. For the planet? She asked with a sage nod. No, he replied. For the Co. Admiral Vorksa watched the Terran starbase crumble under withering fire. It, like most of their defenses, had been pathetic, far too weak to be worth much. So far, there hadn't even been a viable fleet to oppose him or his people. Ground defenses were light, too, with only a handful of police and a few militia organized by the local recruiting stations for their military. Citizen militia were armed, and there had been casualties. Darkness, damn them! There had been casualties. However, world by world, the Terran Republic gave way to the divinity of the ascended Co. But there was a problem. Why don't they give in? He growled and tensed the finger claws of his hands which held onto his seat. That question was being debated heavily among the council. The one-time heretics of the Intakana had defied the divine will of the Ko. It had taken only a handful of battles to bring them back into the fold. The Bavragan needed only one battle to know never to encroach. And yet, they have 50 worlds and we've taken almost 1/5 of them. How can they not know they're beaten? He asked himself that a great deal, even on the worlds that were occupied, handfuls of humans continued to resist, hiding in the larger population and inflicting small acts of sabotage and murder. Begin the landing operation. Seize this Veil world. I want it brought to heel in 5 days. He ordered the troop transports to begin and watched them descend on the world below. The fleet would be held here while it was taken, but a few days of rest would be good for the fleet before moving on. 3 weeks later, he sat slumped in his chair looking at the latest disaster report. How exactly did they ambush us this time? He asked. They defecated on our life sensors to give the illusion of large numbers and laid something they call booby traps everywhere to kill those who came to capture or kill the imaginary army. The exhausted face of the co-ground leader was only a hint of the deep frustration that was being felt by the ones who actually go out and fight the maniacs. He exhaled hard. 2 days before, it had been balloons of military equipment over top of generators to give a false heat signature. Before that, it had been disguising themselves using the skins of animals to get close. Before that, it had been secretly filling artillery with concrete in the middle of the night and then provoking a counterfire. And on top of that, it seemed there was a gun behind every rock and blade of grass. We are gods. Have we finally found devils? The Admiral wondered as the chill ran down his spine. Should we split the fleet? That was the 9th time that had been asked in the last month. Admiral Vorksa glanced at the screen. The world below was in ruins. It hadn't had major cities, but those small ones it held were now more or less flattened. He swiped his hand in front of the screen and the camera began to pan. Valleys that once had a small river were now still flooding. I can't believe they lured us in there and then detonated their own dam. 3,000 gods had died that day, with more requiring bodily augmentation to live functional lives, and then there was all that precious equipment. Somehow they'd stumbled upon a massive human army, and they weren't even halfway to the Sol system. No, they are only human. If we leave, then we are saying we are struggling, and gods do not struggle. They are merely stubborn Zeti burrowing deep within the dirt to avoid being stomped on. If we dig them out of their nests, they will die quickly. We need only keep doing as we do, without being foolish about it, and we will win. The Admiral's words usually would have resulted in echoed approval, but now? Sir, with respect, are we not being reckless? We have lost more in this one battle than we have lost in all divine punishments in the last 5,000 years. This race, it is mad, crazed, beyond reason. We are deep within their territory. The first officer's concerns were quashed at once when Admiral Vorksa slammed his fist upon the table. And we will go deeper. They will crumble. We need only keep pushing them until they surrender. Then from here we will move on from world to world until we reach their home system. Then, when we have captured Sol, and they bend in worship to us and accept their natural place beneath their gods, we will be able to go home again. I understand that, sir, but they have 3 armadas en route to us now. The first officer objected again, and this prompted the scales of the other co-officers to rattle. Objecting once was one thing, but twice. Vorksa's scales began to turn red with anger. What of it? He demanded. As I tried to say, sir, this came in at the start of this cycle. The first officer committed another breach of protocol and swiped the screen away, instead bringing up a transmission. They land! They come back! They come back! It was a meaningless message until the first officer brought up the stellar map again and pointed to the world of origin, and the co-signal transmission stopped. The humans retook a world we took from them. They send transports from 5 or 6 worlds around our occupations, and are descending on others. They are winning back what we have conquered, and still their fleet comes on, while we sit here fighting on a world that has nothing on it to fight over, except for who controls it. The first officer's words created a rattle in the scales of all the present gods. This world does not matter. To humiliate the Terran Empire, we must take Seoul. Fighting over this world is pointless except that we have already begun it. We need to move, the first officer declared, and Vorksa sat sullen and displeased as he looked at the stellar map. No. If we destroy their armadas, that will break them. They must be exhausted already from losing to us. One more victory and we are triumphant, the admiral declared, and a rumbling of approval finally was delivered as it should have been. As if we need fear defeat. We are gods. What are these but mere apes of a backwater world? His scales rattled in disgust as he went about approving new operations to hunt down the local resistance. They'll run out of tricks soon enough. We only have to keep going, he told himself as his confidence reasserted itself again. I would give a long speech to you about your bravery and courage and the fight for our future, but there's no need for that. President Brown said in front of the line of ships. You are brave, and for the brave, a few words are as good as many. Go, fight, destroy the Co. And whether you come back or not, you will live forever in our memories, and forever in their nightmares. Hurrah! 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 The voices of the tens of thousands of crew members went up. Space Marines in their customary black armor raised up their guns, pumping their arms with every cheer. They came from all corners of the Republic, and their war cries and dread vision dominated the screens, not just within the Republic itself, but outside of the Republic where curious onlookers expected to watch the nascent power of the Terran Republic crumble to dust before being swept into the ashbin of history. But it made a very fine moment, no matter the expectations of the onlookers. The ships were the latest models of battleship. They'd taken even longer than usual to build because the designs had to be updated halfway through the construction. John ran a hand through his hair as soon as the cameras were gone. More of it was white than before, he knew, because he could see it reflected in the hull of the nearest battleship. I swear I gained a new white hair every single day after that decision to upgrade the fleet. He thought to himself as he suppressed the shaking of his body, channeling it instead into his relentless work ethic. As the soldiers boarded their respective battleships, he made his way to a private office. Transmissions were waiting for him already. Give up these systems without a fight, and we will take no more. Just a few territories, and we will have peace. There will be peace in our time, if we only have a little more. It is a small price to pay, isn't it? There were dozens of them from surrounding governments. Some of them were very small, relative to the Republic. Some of them were much larger, rivaling the Republic in size or surpassing it. None had declared war. Yet. But with the loss of 12 worlds thus far, and the promise of losing more before a proper fight in the stars could even be made, I feel like a wounded lion just watching buzzards circling overhead. They are waiting for me to die and all my strength to be useless before they come down to tear me apart. He thought as he crafted his responses with care. To the weakest places that were trying to just snip off an opportunistic corner of the Republic, he sent outright refusals. To the others he sent no response, except an offer of trade agreements, while quietly routing a warning to the Senate to fund the building of more armed starbases at hyperlane choke points. We're spending on a deficit right now. We can't do that forever. But if we stop now, we may as well lie down and lick boot. We're finished, John told himself, and down to his soul, he knew he was right. The battle ahead would decide what would happen for humanity, and the weight he felt on him was such in that moment that he was glad he was sitting down. He reached for a bottle and popped a pill. The pain there went away, at least for the moment. But it would be back, just like the endless demands. And his console went off again, revealing that a group of pirates was settling up in an area where the local militia had been broken and was threatening to link up with planetary crime lords to create their own little ideal domain. This is how nations die. They need more than they can create, and they exhaust themselves. The thought passed briefly through the president's mind before he began working out a solution to answer the local governor's concerns. Admiral Pike clung to her sense of reason as the sunless days continued on board her flagship. Every time we think we're safe, it gets worse. she thought as she sat up in bed. Her black skin beaded with sweat, despite the environmental controls meant to make her quarters comfortable. The sweat had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the dreams again. For near the entirety of President Brown's administration, the war had continued onward, and it was draining them all. Defeating the Intakana Confederation had provided some relief, but the Bavragan mercenaries had opened the door to an invasion by the ascended Ko, and they seemed unstoppable. Over 20% of Terran Republic worlds were occupied, only finally stopped by a unique problem that nobody believed would stop them for much longer. And everybody was just tired. We're so damn tired. Starship crews are supposed to cycle out into periods of rest to get planetside every now and then. Nobody is supposed to fight this long. She thought, and tried to recall the particulars of her nightmare. She knew she wasn't the only one suffering from this wartime fatigue. The counselors now had counselors of their own, and the drills had to be cut in half just to provide extra downtime in order to keep the crew as energized as they were. That was merciful in a way. She looked as bad as the rest of them. We're all in the same shit, and that makes it easier to bear, she thought as she rose and began to clean herself up to get ready for another long shift. A communication indicator came on, and the computer relayed the details without her asking for it. This is Captain Nelson of the Red Dawn. Ma'am, it's good to be in Instacom reach with you again. Task Force return will be arriving at Sector Sigma for our rendezvous in 30 days. With luck, we'll arrive on the same day as you and Task Force Liberty. The younger captain's voice was not much less exhausted than her own, but she made no comment about that, instead saying, "Tell me the truth. What do you think our chances are?" "If we catch them with their pants down trying to take another shit on one of our worlds?" he asked. It was crude. It was out of regulation. It was unprofessional, and it felt absolutely right. It was also fair to ask, after all, it was still possible the Ko might choose to abandon conquest of the world below them and instead choose to attack a softer target. Chasing after them seemed somehow worse. Her lack of response to his question seemed to suffice for an answer in his mind, and he answered the Admiral with a more dignified and professional stoicism. "I don't know, I really don't. I've never met Admiral Yi before, but he's supposedly a genius tactician, and we certainly have the numbers on them. Our fleets are the best they can possibly be." "Under the circumstances," she interjected. "Under the circumstances." He admitted before going on, tacitly acknowledging the exhaustion of his own crew after a 7-year war that had turned disastrously wrong right when it seemed it might end. "I've gone over the plan as thoroughly as you have, ma'am, and even outnumbering them 5-1. I just don't know." "Yi sent out something yesterday. Did you receive it?" she asked. "Yes. He said we have an advantage they don't have, and we're going to use that to force them to retreat." Captain Nelson cleared his throat and said, "We know how to lose." It made no sense to me. I hoped you'd know what he meant, I sure don't. But on another note, you're being promoted to Admiral. Congratulations. She said it so offhandedly that he almost missed it. The weariness of his mind was such that he barely registered it as a positive. "Thank you, Admiral." He said it without enthusiasm. "I'll try to live up to the rank." "I know." She replied to him at once, similarly nonplussed. Numb was now their new normal, and as such, she hadn't expected a cheer, and nobody was doing ceremonies for anything anymore. "I'll see you when we reach the Veil, and hopefully, I'll see you on the other side of it," she said as solemnly, and killed her transmission side. "Same to you, Admiral." He answered, and killed his side, thus completing the termination of their link. Day slipped into day with a kind of blessed monotony for the rest of the month, as news continued to come out about the situation on planet Valetudinaria. The Ko soldiers continued to land, and there were no more major settlements unoccupied. However, much to the relief of the Terran Republic, the Ko had no interest in taking slaves, nor in massacring the inhabitants. They came, they fought, and almost seemed to follow a Republic model of rules of war, with no conception of how to fight a dirty war. A failing that allowed the colonists to continue to resist in the hinterlands or in the occupied settlements. but the Co were still winning. It was just slow. President John Brown seemed almost beyond the very concept of exhaustion to those who knew him. Each day he rose, went before the Senate, proposed solutions and allocations of resources regarding problems, and otherwise displayed no hint that he was troubled by the conflict. No hint but one. His hair was turning whiter by the day, as if every problem slew a follicle. As if he was drawing on the years of his life for strength, he continued his nightly broadcast. "We are not defeated until we surrender, and if we never surrender, we are never beaten." He'd said it 1,000 times, it seemed, but little by little its efficacy waned, and really it was only the resistance of the veil that held humanity together at this stage. "If we lose this, the Senate will force my hand." He pursed his lips as he straightened up his suit with a slight tug at the base of his coat. Committed as he was to the Republic, he often couldn't help but think, no wonder people like dictatorships. The decision is made and it's done. No compromise necessary when you know you're right. He shook his head, frowning at his own impure thought. We fight to the bitter end, whatever that means. He resolved and left his office to go and get to work again. Admiral Yi watched the map of systems continue to shrink as the task force closed in on their destination. The Veil existed in a unique system, and the unique system had created a unique world, one tailor-made for those who knew it well. He showed no sign of weariness. His forces were fresh and, though untried, he drilled them relentlessly and uncompromisingly on the known data of the Co warships. The Co have very advanced ships, but they have no true conception of what it is to fight a long war, nor do they know what it is to lose. The warrior heritage of humankind was deep and wide as an ocean, born from the first moment two cavemen picked up rocks to slaughter one another with, and only growing greater as time had gone on. By contrast, in all his studies of the ascended Co, they were used to showing up, winning a battle by overwhelming might, and then having demonstrated the uselessness of resistance, returned home to receive worship and tithes from their puppets. When the hyperlane was close on his monitor, he only nodded at his navigation officer. Go. It wasn't a grand speech, it was just an order. That was all it took for the sailor of the void to act, and the stars became blurs as his fleet rushed to link arms with his counterparts into one single whole that was 3 times the size of the one that had brought the sacred dark to heel years before. It would have been impressive if it hadn't been backed by war bonds and debt spending that would take 20 years to repay if they were lucky. Better in debt than in the grave, Yi thought, and on his screen the 2 faces of his counterparts appeared. Admiral, they all said at once, and a rare smile touched their 3 faces in the same moment. Do you think they know we're coming? Admiral Pike asked. I don't see how they couldn't, but they're so hidebound by their own rules that they haven't moved their fleet out of position to meet us at the hyperlane exit. I think they won't move until we show up. Once we do, they'll leave planetary orbit to keep us from targeting their ground troops. Correct. Yi agreed with a nod. Just remember, stick to the plan. Do not move in until I give the order. I know it is counterintuitive, but you will have to trust me. Admiral Nelson and Admiral Polk both inhaled deeply through their nostrils, then gave reluctant nods of their own. All we can do is go forward and hope for the best. There's no more planning to be done. There's only do or die. Admiral Pike added, but Admiral Nelson chuckled a little, drawing curious expressions from both Yi and Pike alike. Not exactly. Do and die is also an option, he said, and began a long, dark laugh at his own gallows humor. It spread from him to his counterparts, and for the first time in a long time, they had much-needed laughs of their own, before they killed their lynx and set a course to see what would happen next. Admiral Vorksa shivered as he looked at the screen. They must be gathering their courage to die. He had heard that suggestion hurled at the humans many times now. The 3 armadas were certainly large, and a few officers who were more weary than the others had suggested the nigh unthinkable. Abandon our position to go fight them? No, 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 he thought, and that seemed to be just what the humans wanted. For almost a month, as one fleet after the other appeared in the Sigma system, None of them moved beyond what appeared to be routine drills or maintenance. It was as if they were trying to lure Vorksa's armada out of position. Not a chance. They're a tricky species, certainly, and they might have hidden troop ships ready to come in and reinforce the Veil before we can return. That would drag out our conquest for months more, but why don't they all just give up already? Over a dozen worlds and not a victory to their name. With this, the Co would be only a few hyperlanes from the Sol system, where most of the Terran Empire's shipyards were still located. It grated that this world had been directly in their path, but fortified by man and nature alike or not, its existence meant that protocol required it be taken to ensure no problems lay behind them. Ever committed to doing things the right way, even if the Terrans refused to cooperate, he persisted. And now it was finally paying off. The human armadas that had linked up at Sigma were now moving. The advanced sensors of the Co vessels had the speed and trajectory mapped down to the span of a single finger, and with that, he sent the signal out to the rest of his armada. Bombardment would need to cease temporarily, and ship-to-ship weapons powered up. The human vessels were slower, but like the great ice ages that had come and gone on the worlds of the ascended Co, their coming seemed inevitable. At least it meant there was no hurry. Everything in its own time. A few days of rest for the crew will do them good. We can face the humans well-rested when they reach us. He thought, and that seemed a very good idea indeed. Yi bit back the urge to tell the others to stick to his instructions. They each had their part to play in the overall battle strategy, and a code that the Co could not possibly break was to be their guide. The code was not an encryption, but rather music. As they exited the hyperwarp, the strings of the 1812 overture began. The subtle sounds were peaceful at first, settling the souls of mankind as minute died and birthed each new minute after it. The monitors of hundreds of ships showed the ascended Co leaving orbit and taking up a formation to advance against the humans, doing just as their standard playbook told them to do. Not yet, Yi said softly to no one in particular. The ships were moving in, massive long objects of doom for uncounted ages, older than mankind. The fallen empire retained more power than will to use it, and so the fleet coming on constituted the overwhelming majority of their forces. The first torpedoes began to launch from Co vessels, some of them larger than the frigates of Terran ships. Each one spelled doom for someone. Not yet, Yi said under his breath again, as he watched the Co advance reach the outskirts of the system's sun. Terran ships were taking up their formations, an aggressive diamond formation for the bulk, with smaller, faster ships on the wings, the flagships of the Admiralty buried in the middle and ready to take point when needed. Still, the Co vessels came on. The Terran interceptor vessels launched to try to take down the armored torpedoes of the Co to prevent the destruction of some unfortunates. Blasts of light struck the tips, the center, the rockets of the torpedoes, but whether the light was plasma or lightning, it was as if they fought the winds of the storm with a mere handheld fan. And as the Co formations spread out in their broad line, meant to allow maximum fire and a myriad of targets that their doctrine said should be easily destroyed, Yi whispered to himself again as his fist clenched tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Not yet. The music picked up the pulses and pumping blood of the human listeners who understood it instinctively as indicative of rising action. Weapon systems were primed, torpedoes loaded, and energy blasts a dozen times more powerful than anything used in the Idiaxa War were waiting to be unleashed. Hold, Yi whispered again. Sir, we're detecting something unusual. His science officer spoke up and all eyes on the bridge turned to him. From the star, the crescendo struck, and the cannons erupted over every comm channel at once, and with it, the star erupted in a series of massive plasmic flares, which struck outward in space and lanced across 100 Co ships in one single moment of glorious light and destruction. Now! Yi shouted, and the Terran armadas leapt their ships forward as they pumped power into their engines. A few ships erupted into the fires of damnation as they were destroyed by torpedoes, but there were yet hundreds more following. Unleash hell! Admirals Pike and Nelson bellowed, and the music victorious of Adrian von Ziegler sent out a wave of drums and pipes to match the spirit of the fleet. Hundreds of torpedoes and missiles became thousands, and the formations of light ships on the wings zipped ahead with war cries in the throats of those resolved to conquer or die. Cries the Zo could not understand any more than they understood what horror had fallen on them as their shields were nearly crippled, and a number of ships too close to the star died and added their debris to its mass forever in an instant. "What happened? Damage report!" Admiral Vorksa shouted the command as the true horror of the situation was already taking shape in his head. Have they figured out how to cause that? He asked himself, but it seemed impossible. No, it was impossible. If they could, they'd have done it by now, or even if this was their first use, why not use it twice? Doesn't matter. We have to win first. He threw the thought aside and hastened to give out his orders. Advance and destroy. Intact ships move in front of those too damaged to fight. Admiral Pike watched the destruction with the giddiness of a schoolgirl. With the shields of large parts of the ascended Co fleet badly depleted, her own ships stood a fighting chance. "Hammer those fuckers like nails," she ordered, and the quickening drums were a call to the blood of warriors back 1,000 generations. Exhaustion was forgotten, the fear of defeat was forgotten. There was only the drums of war and their guns. The blazing fire of the massive armada continued to hammer the Co vessels, and the triangle formation of vessels began to split apart, spreading out targets and opening up yet more withering fire on the damaged vessels of the undefeated Co. The flaring of the shields of their enemies were like celebratory fireworks to the eyes of the Republic vessels, and when the fireworks died, so did the ships. The thick armor of Co vessels was meant to hold up against weakened, diminished opponents whose vessels had been destroyed or damaged by overwhelming fire, while the majority of their protection lay in powerful shields. But with their destruction, Co vessels began to shake, as if the very ships of the mighty ancients were now afraid of the horde of monsters that fell on them like packs of wolves. Half the fleet was dead before Admiral Vorksa shouted, "How can this be happening?" The answer from the universe was a flare of light from a Terran missile that seemed as massive as a star on his monitor before it broke through the cracked armor and smashed his bridge in one blinding final moment before all went dark for him and all his crew forever. The blasts back and forth continued unabated, but the end was certain long before the end, and the Terran Republic learned something else of the Co doctrine that day. They had no regulations or processes for strategic retreat, as if they had never imagined that defeat was even possible. Though they were down to 1/10 of their numbers, they continued firing and flying through space as much as they could. Even when there was only one ship left, reality was seemingly denied as impossible, right up until it exploded. "Bring up the transports, land reinforcements, and take back this world. Admiral Pike, Admiral Nelson, excellent work. Take your fleets and 1/3 of the transports each, and begin reclaiming captured colonies." Admiral Yi ordered, and on screen, 2 sweating faces appeared, panting with exertion, as if they'd fought the fight by hand in the old ways. "Of course," Admiral Pike said, speaking first. "But can I ask, what was that? A new weapon?" "No, it was old knowledge. The sun here is highly prone to flares when magnetic fields get entangled, and that happens every few hundred years. I studied the star charts for this region and all events tied to it going back for centuries, and an old alien recording showed the ideal conditions so well that it was more or less a countdown. I just had to know when the tides were in our favor, so to speak, and put the Co there. They may be brave, but they are not thorough." Yi smiled a little bit and winked at his counterparts. A genius indeed. The two thought quietly as the connections were cut, and all three went about their duty to the Republic with spirits renewed by an unprecedented victory. 40 Terran ships died despite the advantage, but there were no Co remaining in the area except on the planetary surface, which were in no position to do anything about the Republic fleet hovering over their heads. let alone the uncountable reinforcements of xenomorphs, handlers, and genetically modified soldiers equipped with state-of-the-art weaponry and support logistics. Exactly how long it would take to crush the invaders was uncertain, but as communications were established with the surface resistance, and landings began that would encircle the co-military positions, Admiral Yi could be sure of one thing at least. It won't take long. The news of the victory at the Battle of the Veil swept over Republic news networks like wildfire, for not only was it a victory bought by drowning the Co in the blood of humanity, but rather it was an overwhelming triumph. The details were unmentioned, but the casualty lists were short, and dozens upon dozens of science vessels were already moving to go and analyze the shattered material of the Co vessels. Academics with no interest in war were very interested in the fruits of success. But for most, it meant something else. We're not losing. We're not going to lose. We're going to win. War bond sales went up 300% in the day after the victory spread out over the Republic. Agitators among the Intakana and other former members of the Confederation immediately fell silent, stricken with horror that those who they held as gods could be overthrown. Rorona Jean, on learning of the triumph of the human fleet, could only shake his head. "Curse you, cousins, for ever taking us into battle against the slayers of our people's gods," he thought, and went back to doing his best to make sure nobody fomented a rebellion, more sure now than before that he would succeed in making a lasting peace. On the Co-homeworlds, the fallen empire reacted with abject horror. With no fleet to protect their soldiers and Terrans ruling the skies again, landing tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of soldiers, their armies began to dwindle and die, or worse, do the unthinkable, and surrender to those they intended to make into faithful worshippers. The prisoner tallies began to rise, and their own much-valued soldiers fell into the hands of humanity. The transmission of the Terran president was playing on a loop in their council chambers as the Co-leadership argued over what to do. "Give up your war, and we return your people." It was a simple statement, and the result of refusal was already clear in the reports of 9 armies that had come into contact with large Terran ground troops, along with their sky-dominating fleets. Death. There was no question in their minds of what order to give after that. Pull back. Admit nothing, but pull back. The simple 3-sentence order saw the last 9 worlds abandoned without a fight, with Co-armies taking to the skies and fleeing for home as fast as their troop ships could carry them. Within another month, there were no Co-occupied worlds, and Admiral Yi's words made sense to Admirals Nelson and Pike. They aren't used to taking serious casualties, so doing so strikes terror into their whatever passes for hearts. Their spirit for war was weakened by centuries of easy victories, and now they can't bear to lose as much as we can. Genius. Admiral Pike praised the man as she oversaw yet another bloodless triumph on a border world. And just like that, the war simply petered out. President John Brown lay quietly in his bed after a long day full of speeches and celebration, shaking the hands of heroes as the Co sent a single statement across the Terran net. "We go home. Do not visit us or we will destroy you." It was as close to a peace treaty as the ancients ever entered into. That night, President Brown went to sleep with a smile on his face that he hadn't worn in years. To the shock of scores of worlds, he did not wake up. In the aftermath of the conflict, events flowed like driftwood over a raging river. The captured Co who had not pulled back in time were sent home in exchange for the Co interceding with the Bavragan to compel the return of the captured humans, thus neatly avoiding a continuation of the war by President Brown's successor. Though many would say that the death of President Brown was the luckiest they could have been, as had he lived, he certainly would have prosecuted a war of principle to crush the mass of mercenaries on the doorstep of the Terran Republic. His successor, Vice President Kenneth Chambers, saw fit instead to accept a victorious peace that would also allow a smooth transition into power for the last year and some of the president's term. He remarked on the day in which he took office, "Oh, my captain, our fearful trip is done." And thereafter measures were swiftly presented as a way to honor the late president's contribution to the future of the Republic, namely in the form of providing funds for re-education and general teaching for the sudden inclusion of tens of billions of new citizens into the Terran government, teaching them their rights, how voting and elections worked, and the tiered system of rule that ensured planets could run the day-to-day while still contributing to the strength of the While. Unsurprisingly, Kana mourned the death of their human liberator as deeply as any Republic citizen, and they enlisted into the Republic military in the tens of millions. When Rorona Jean learned of the death of the late president, he was in the middle of composing a speech of his own, encouraging his people to adapt to change rather than to resist it, and his thoughts and feelings ran in two different directions. Yes, he was my enemy. But if all enemies comported themselves so with the vanquished, there would be less enmity in the galaxy. It was as high a praise as he felt right giving under the circumstances, and he returned to work thereafter, without missing a beat. The other fallen member states of the late Confederacy seemed content to continue their tradition of following Inta-Kana lead, and within a few months, political parties styled after the Terran Republic models were springing up like weeds. The deficit spending was ended by the deaths of so many excess ships in the final Great Battle, and they were simply not rebuilt. Admirals Nelson and Pike closed out the war as most of the rest of the Republic did, by trying their best to drink the nearest planet dry of alcohol. They sat across from one another in the officers' club with a slew of empty bottles between them and their respective staffs. Most of both groups had passed out entirely, and the ones who weren't face down on the table and snoring were close enough to it that it made no difference. The usual restrictions had been briefly lifted both to celebrate the end and to properly mourn the loss of the leader whose call to liberty made it nigh insane for any race to deal in Terran slaves. "I suppose Yi was right," Susan said thoughtfully. Her amber eyes were glassed over, but after the stupendous way in which Admiral Yi had duped the Co into damaging their fleet so badly, she felt the need to discuss it further. "Yes, he was. They just couldn't take the casualties on a morale level. All that power and they get one shartling moment and they just give up." Nelson hiccuped as he slurred his words. "What a way to win." "Do you think we'll fight them again?" Susan Pike asked as she began to see doubles of her counterpart. Nelson looked down at the bottom of his bottle. There wasn't much left in it, so he chugged the last bit of bourbon and savored the feeling of its burn going down his throat, then replied, "How many shides are there in this galaxy?" he asked. Susan thought it over. Her fuzzy, alcohol-soaked brain had a hard time counting known empires near and far, and she began working the answer out on her fingers before Nelson evidently grew tired of waiting and answered. "Just 2. He held up a fist. "There's the Republic, and everybody who hidin' in it. Only real question-ish. Which one of them one we gonna fight next?" It was more than a drunken rant. It sounded more like an ominous prophecy, but one she was ill-equipped to refute. It did, however, ruin her desire to keep drinking, and she returned to her quarters to sleep off the booze, leaving Nelson to pass out at the table on his own eventually. Admiral Yi proved one thing above all else. He understood the nature of the Ascended Co's true weakness as no one else ever had. They had never suffered mass casualties, nor had they fought a protracted war against a strident and unyielding opponent. With enough strong ships, the gap in power could be bridged, and with sufficient knowledge of the space of battle, the tide could be turned to his advantage. He, unlike most of the Republic, was sober, having given up alcohol decades before. Instead, he celebrated by reading a new book, enjoying a quiet soda, a little music, and the brief quiet calm of peace that followed the end of war. As the winsome symphony air and simple gifts began to play within his quarters, he reflected on all that had come and gone for the Republic since the war began. "We won't end up in a war again for a very long time, not unless we're unlucky enough to elect a fool. After beating one of the ancient races of the galaxy, no matter how narrowly it was, the other empires will think twice about tangling with us, at least for a time. But that won't last. It can't. Peace, after all, is nothing but the period of time between 2 wars. but at least I can enjoy it for now, while we have it. He thought, and turned the page of his book with a smile as he enjoyed the quiet music that was his reward for a job well done.